Tonight, along a roadway in southern Mexico, a seemingly endless stream of people making their way on foot towards the United States.
Best diner in New York City. He came from Greece when he was 16, hoping for a better life.
You have to work.
You have to work.
You own a diner, you gotta work more
You're a slave.
than 8 hours.
Hello everyone, I'm Bobtheorc, and today we're going to have an honest conversation about immigration. And this is something I've thought about for a long time. Recently I was talking with somebody on Twitter, and he asked some questions that I couldn't just explain in a 140-character tweet, so I thought this would be a better way to put it. So, you know who you are. I'm making this video partially for you and partially just to express my thoughts on a nuanced topic. You know, it's immigration's not quite as cut and dry as a lot of people on the left and right would think. And I'm going to break it down to sort of three broad topics where my ideas lay. You know, talking about, you know, the American culture and tradition, what makes a good and bad immigrant, you know, helping the individual versus helping the group, because there's often different priorities involved depending on what your objective is. And then we'll also talk about assimilation and long and short-term and long-term effects about immigration. And there's a lot of things to consider if we want to be honest with ourselves about how this all works. Now first, I want to take a quick moment and talk about my website, bobtheorc.com. You know, I make all these videos myself. I'm not making any money doing this. This is just for fun. On my website, you can find a free copy of my dad's book, How to Beat Inflation. Dad's a retired PhD economist. He taught all over the world and used to work for the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City. And you might find that information useful, especially as we're dealing with some very difficult economic times. So I have that posted for free on my website, and you guys are welcome to download it and read it and share it with your friends as long as you acknowledge that Dad wrote it. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the American culture and tradition. Now, some people would say that America doesn't have a culture, and that's not quite right. You know, my father's side of the family came to America a very long time ago. I believe the first beaver to die in America came over with the early Spanish explorers. There's a beaver tombstone from 1503 in Florida somewhere that my grandmother once found. There's beaver tombstones from the early 1600s in Beavertown, Ohio, which my family allegedly founded. So, you know, my dad's side of the family's been here for a very long time. And they would argue that there are definitely American traditions. My mom's side of the family came over from Greece much more recently. In fact, there was a little bit of a scandal when Mom and Dad first got married, because they were the first mixed-race culture, or mixed-race marriage in the Greek culture in the Greek community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and so there's a little bit of a scandal. I realize nowadays Greeks are basically just considered white, but back then it was different. And even growing up, I took a little bit of shit for being mixed race. Wasn't really that big of a deal. I just ignored the people who were doing it, and in perspective, I didn't receive as much shit as some of my black friends did, so it wasn't a big deal. But growing up, I definitely experienced a tangibly different culture between the Greek side of the family and the more Americanized side of the family and my dad's side. And if you think about it, the founding American principles, while not specifically religious, you know, there is a separation of church and state specifically so that there's no state-sponsored religion like they had in England. But, you know, the American founding was broadly based on Judeo-Christian values. Or you could broaden it further by saying the values of the Abrahamic faiths. But there was definitely the idea that in order for this experiment in freedom and liberty to work, you needed people with a common set of morals, values, and traditions, and these were, broadly speaking, of a of a Judeo-Christian, somewhat Protestant work ethic kind of values. You had the idea of freedom and liberty, limited government, personal responsibility, self-empowerment, hard work, honesty. And because America doesn't have a founding race. I know that especially the left these days, you guys are obsessed with race. But remember back then, even the British drew very big racial distinctions between, like, the Scottish and the Irish and the English and, the Welsh and whatnot. I mean, look at what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now. Having been to both countries a number of times, having a large number of Russian and Ukrainian friends, I can't really tell the difference. If you were to put a Ukrainian and a Russian standing in front of me, I couldn't tell the difference. But they sure as hell could. So I think that the idea that we have here in America about race is very naive. And going forward, I'm not going to be talking about race specifically. I know it's the cool thing nowadays to accuse everybody you disagree with of being a racist, bigot, whatever. Look, I'm not racist. If you accuse me of being racist, I'm just going to assume that you're an idiot and I'm not going to take you seriously. That being said, there is a common culture and set of traditions. And tradition's important. There's a reason that America has been broadly successful. Despite all the screw-ups, and I'll be the first to admit America's screwed up an awful lot throughout history. But broadly speaking, the American ethic, the American culture has been successful. And in many ways, the reason we won the Cold War, if you ask a lot of my Eastern European and Russian friends, they all adore the American culture. They want to be more like us. And so our culture is pervasive. It's very influential on the world stage. Look how popular Hollywood is. I know a lot of the modern movies kind of suck, but up until recently, when they ran out of new ideas and just started remaking old things, the American culture in our music and in our entertainment, in our philosophy, our ideas, has spread throughout the world and has been very influential. And while it's hard to specifically nail down exactly what American culture is, anybody who's been in America long enough has sort of a subconscious idea of what it is. And these are, I would say that it is a general balancing of the prioritization of the individual while considering the overall needs of the group at large. America is definitely an individualistic culture. We prioritize personal freedom and liberty as long as it doesn't adversely affect the group. And we're even willing to tolerate a certain amount of degeneracy and disadvantage towards the larger group if it favors the individual, within reason. That being said, the American culture is very complicated, and our economy is advanced. And you need a lot of skills to be able to be successful in America. And if we think about what makes a good immigrant versus a bad immigrant, we have to take this into consideration. Generally speaking, highly educated people do well in America compared to those who are not. Now, if you look at our political elites, our ruling elites, they generally want to bring in a bunch of low-skill poorly educated immigrants. And the reason they want to do that is because they want an ignorant voter base that'll vote for bigger government and allow for more corruption, because that's what they're used to in their home countries. And a lot of them also want large quantities of cheap labor, which lowers the overall wages of the poor and working class. I know a lot of rich people out east, where I grew up in New York City, who have their low-paid maids and servants and whatnot. And you know, let's face it, I wouldn't clean a house for less than $50 an hour. Nobody's going to pay me $50 an hour to go clean a house. And if you can pay somebody minimum wage, or a lot of times less than minimum wage, that's, you know, that's why they do it. You know, look at all the low income, low wage farm workers and whatnot. We get a lot of that here in Oklahoma. People who are probably getting paid, you know, terrible wages to go help harvest crops and whatnot. So, if we're being honest, we want, you know, the immigrants who become successful are highly educated. You know, there's a lady who came in my office a few weeks ago from, I believe she was from Kenya, and you know, I think she's a lawyer or something, you know, in the legal profession. She's very smart. You know, I could have the details wrong, but she was highly intelligent. You know, and we see a lot, you know, here in Oklahoma where I currently hunker down. You know, we see a lot of international students at the university, and they're all highly intelligent. And a lot of these people stay in America and assimilate quite nicely and become very productive citizens, and they become quite successful. You know, and I know a lot of people, you know, even who are not terribly well educated. You know, I was talking with some Mexicans at Home Depot a couple years ago, and you know, while they came here legally, they weren't particularly well educated. They did roofing for a living, and they were telling me that because they specialize in roofing large apartment complexes, they each make about $150,000 a year. Okay, well, that's fantastic. That's awesome. And you know, these guys work their butts off. And so I think a combination of hard work and education will make an immigrant quite successful. You know, when my mom's family came to America probably about 100 years ago or so, you know, they came from Greece. They were very hardworking. They were very entrepreneurial. They started up produce business and restaurants and whatnot, and they did quite well. So there's definitely a formula for what makes an immigrant successful, for what makes a good immigrant to the United States. That being said, you know, I also know of immigrants who've come here, you know, whether illegally or as refugees, and they end up in ghettos and they end up screwed. And the I've got a friend, and he has a kid. And the kid's currently staying with me. Smart kid, but when he came here, you know, he wasn't particularly well educated. I'm not going to go into too many details, but you know, the mom's from Africa, the dad's from here. They met in the military and had the kid, and stuff didn't work out. But at one point, you know, for emergency reasons, the kid had to come here. The mom sent the kid here, and because he was, you know, American, you know, by his, you know, because of his father, he's able to come in legally. And you know, the kid's had a really rough life. And he told me that, you know, with as rough as his life is here, it's way better than it was where he grew up in Ethiopia. And, you know, he's having to play catch up in school, and he's having to work his ass off. But because he wasn't particularly well educated, English was his fourth language, so he didn't speak it very well at first. He had a really hard time. And I think he'll be successful because he's got good people around him helping him. Would that make him a bad immigrant? Well, you know, it certainly makes it more difficult for him than somebody coming over as a doctor or a lawyer. So when people come over, their skill set and their work ethic will largely determine how successful they are. And while I would say that most of the immigrants I've met are hardworking, you know, there are many of the criminal mindset as well, probably a small percentage. But if we're being honest, you know, we need to also acknowledge the fact that when people come illegally across the border, I'm sure most of them are fine and just wanting a better life. But, you know, there are stories out there about, you know, South American, Central American companies trying to dump their prison population on us, or various terrorists trying to sneak in. You know, border security has caught a number of terrorists, people on the terrorist watch list trying to come in. So we can't be naive about this. And so that's the first thing that I want to talk about. You know, we have to understand that America does have a culture, it does have traditions, and that depending on who comes over, you know, the people coming over will be successful or unsuccessful largely by their own merits. America, broadly speaking, is a meritocratic country. Yeah, it's unfair, and there's, you know, life is unfair. Nothing's perfect. But we generally respect a high degree of merit compared to other places. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is helping the individual versus helping the group. And depending on your priorities, this can make a big difference. Now, for example, most people coming from most places will do better in America than they will in their home country. That's broadly true. You know, unless you're talking about maybe Western Europe, you know, compared to most countries, America's doing pretty good. And so if you want to help an individual out, you know, all of my various Eastern European friends, any of them would probably do better in America as an individual than they would in you know, back where they're from. You know, most of my, you know, I had a friend, I had a roommate from Ethiopia when I was in college. His name was Lidge. And he was a very cool guy. He was very smart. He could have been wildly successful here in America with how intelligent he was and hardworking. Now, he chose to go back to Ethiopia. You know, while he was at university, he developed methods for modular construction that would revolutionize the housing industry in Ethiopia. And he wanted to take that back to his home country and improve his country, because he wanted to help the group. And when you consider helping the group, in most cases, the people want to come to America largely because America is in better shape than their country is. A lot of these countries have problems. And if we were serious about helping the majority of people, about helping the group itself, you know, we would probably focus our efforts in helping fix up and invest in those countries. Over the years, we've invested a lot of money into Mexico, for example. And if you look at the illegal immigrants coming in, and when I say illegal, don't get your panties in a twist. I'm talking about people are coming in without government authorization. There's a legal process to come into America, and the people who bypass that process are, legally speaking, considered illegal. I don't personally give a shit that much, but when I'm talking about it, you know, like I said, we need to be honest, and I'm not going to mince words in this conversation. So, according to my Mexican friends, and yes, I have lots of Mexican friends, the country of Mexico has done quite better over the recent years. I know they still have a big cartel problem, and that's a separate issue. But a lot of the people coming over illegally, the ones trying to sneak in or claiming asylum, etc., a lot of those people are from Central and South America, where they have even bigger problems. And over the years, as we've invested in Mexico, we've improved the lifestyle in Mexico through economic investment. And this causes there to be less of an immigration pressure, because America's not as much better now as it was, you know, 50 years ago. If we were serious about helping the largest number of people, then we could take, for example, the, $5 trillion we spent blowing up various countries in North Africa and the Middle East and Southern Asia during the War on Terror. We could have spent that money, even a fraction of that money, killing off the drug cartels, stopping the drug cartels, and fixing up, investing economically in the Central and South American countries. I personally happen to be a strong believer of the Monroe Doctrine. I think that we should be focused on our hemisphere, and we should let the great powers of Europe and Asia deal with their own mess. Because we, frankly, as a civilization, do not understand certainly Eastern Europe or Asia or Africa all that well. And we tend to screw up more than we help. But that's my personal opinion. But if we were to destroy the drug cartels, destroy all of the various, criminal organizations, and create a sense of stability and law and order in the Western Hemisphere, especially in the South, and invest even a fraction of the money that we've spent wasting on foreign wars over the last 20 years, I think that we would have a vastly different situation, and many of these countries would be in very good shape. And this in turn would improve their quality of life and reduce immigration pressure. Because most people are coming to America for economic reasons and not for cultural reasons. And when you think about what benefits America, as a rule, we want high-skilled individuals who come here for who come here because they like our culture. They want to assimilate into our culture. But we also have to be careful. If we bring too many high-skilled individuals over, we might benefit as a country, but their country will suffer. For example, in the 1970s, you had a revolution in Iran where what we would consider to be Islamic extremists, they may not, took over the country. And there was a mass exodus from Iran of highly skilled individuals, doctors, lawyers, etc. And they all came here to America, or a lot of them did. And what's interesting, if you look at the after effect, is the average IQ of Iranian Americans is about one standard deviation higher than the average IQ of the Iranians who remained in Iran. Now, why is that? Well, because all the smart people left, because they're like, screw this, we're not going to get oppressed by this religious group that doesn't share our values. And so they left. They came here. There's a guy who owns the local chain of pizza restaurants who told me about it. He's from Iran. He was a college student here in the University of Oklahoma when the 1970s revolution happened. And he said, screw it, I'm not going back. And he applied for asylum here. He stayed here. And now he owns a chain of pizza restaurants. It's good pizza, too. Maybe not as good as New York pizza, but, for Oklahoma standards, probably the best pizza, or some of the best pizza here in Oklahoma. But he's a very smart person, and when all the smart people leave, you have a dumbing down of the country. And we've seen this in a lot of war-torn countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, in any place where America has intervened or where there's been revolution or war. Smart people tend to be the ones who have the means to get out. And the dumb people, frankly, they get stuck. And it has an overall negative effect to that country. Now, it's great for us. We got all the smart people. Look at all the German scientists that came over after World War II, for example. Look at all of the, smart refugees that we get coming from various turmoil-stricken countries from around the world. They call it a brain drain. There's a reason that America has so many brilliant scientists and engineers, because a lot of these people from other countries want to get out of their mess and they come here. And it's great for us. It's not great for their country. So if we're being honest about helping the whole world and raising up the world as a whole, then we need to consider this fact. In my personal opinion, I think that it would be better off for humanity as a whole if we invested in these countries, help stabilize these countries, and make them a better place. And I think that would improve overall, the state of the world. Just like my friend Lidge, who came to America, got a great education, had some good ideas, brought them back to Ethiopia, and made Ethiopia a slightly better place. But that's not necessarily beneficial to the individual. They'd probably individually lead a better life if they came here. And that's something we have to balance and consider. So there's not really a cut and dry answer to that. Now, from America's perspective, we're going to get real selfish here for a moment. From America's perspective, America is one of the most successful countries in the world at assimilating foreign populations. And I'm talking largely about cultural assimilation. You know, we have a very pervasive culture. It's a very infectious culture. People like the idea of freedom and personal liberty, personal responsibility. They like the idea that, in general, your personal actions contribute the majority of your success. You know, there's other factors, but in general, your actions play the largest role in determining your success in life. And this is true broadly across pretty much any, any population within America. The caveat is that there seems to be a certain rate at which we can assimilate people. It takes time for somebody to learn about American culture and tradition. A lot of these younger kids on the internet now have already, learned a lot about this. But, and they tend to have an easier time, assimilating into American culture. You know, older people have a harder time, and it takes them longer. But we need to consider the fact that it takes time. A single family brought into America and put in an area where they have good people around them to help them assimilate, they're going to tend to assimilate faster. When you get a mass migration situation and they all end up in a ghetto, some of these, Asian ghettos or Somalian ghettos or whatever, they tend to insulate and they don't assimilate as quickly. If you look at my mom's side of the family, there was a strong Greek community in Tulsa, and they were largely insular. They'd been there probably for 50 years, 60 years before my mom and dad got married. And they were the first, to marry outside. Mom was the first to marry outside the Greek community. If there hadn't been so many Greeks in that concentrated area, they probably would have assimilated a lot faster. On the other hand, by maintaining a large Greek community, they preserved their Greek culture to much larger effect. And there's nothing wrong with preserving your home culture. Personally, I'm culturally very Greek. I'm also politically very American. And the secret is to success. The secret to successful assimilation is allowing an immigrant family to maintain their culture, but also having them realize that the American culture and traditions are now the dominant culture. And so, as much as I feel at home with my Greek traditions, my American traditions take precedent. And that's the secret to successful assimilation, is remembering your home traditions from where you came from, but also acknowledging that the American traditions, or the traditions of any host country, are now the dominant traditions. Because when you first arrive in a foreign country, you're a guest of that country. I love having house guests in my house. I enjoy having my friends over, but I don't want the friends to trash the place. And I want them to respect my way of doing things. And America has a very set way of doing things that we've established over the last, couple hundred years. Or longer, depending on where you believe these traditions have started. And there's short-term and long-term effects to immigration and assimilation that we have to consider. Short-term, you're going to see, an influx of some of these foreign cultures, and they'll have some effect, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But and you could see a short-term decrease in wages as immigrants often are willing to work for less than their American counterparts. That's just how it is. I think long-term it's probably a benefit, as long as we maintain the American culture as the dominant culture. Now, something to consider, I know that a lot of liberals in particular are very keen on mass immigration. And while I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily opposed to immigration on a large scale, I should caution them that many of the immigrants that they're so happy to have come over have very conservative beliefs. And then you run into problems sometimes. For example, a lot of the Hispanic immigrants and Muslim immigrants and Eastern European immigrants are not really down with the whole LGBTQ thing. They're not so down on all the pronoun thing. They know exactly which bathroom to use, and they come from very traditional cultures. For example, I have a gay friend who lives in Moscow, and he is probably the most liberal Russian I know. And yet he firmly believes that marriage is an institution between a man and a woman, because he's also Russian Orthodox and super conservative. And so even though he'd be considered a super liberal heretic by Russian standards, y'all would probably call him a far-right neo-Nazi here in America by American standards. And so what I think you're seeing is you're going to see a long-term, as these people assimilate, some of their, assimilation works both ways. You're going to see a lot of their cultural beliefs impacting America. For example, a lot, the recent Roe versus Wade decision in the Supreme Court. You could easily draw a correlation as you have more Hispanic voters, and, the Hispanics are largely Catholic, and Catholics are largely opposed to abortion. Why would that surprise you? So you have to consider that it works both ways, and the rate of assimilation is very important. Now, my father would argue from an economic perspective that the current American economy and resources could only really maintain a population of about 250 million people at a good standard of living. Broadly speaking, the resources of a country, the economy of a country, are divided, not evenly, but they're divided among the people. And if you assume that about half of the wealth goes to the top 10% and the other half of the wealth gets spread among the bottom 90%, that's still a lot of wealth, but as that bottom 90% increases, that bottom half of the wealth is going to be spread among more and more people. And right now, while we have a decreasing standard of living, we're no longer in a situation where a single working class husband can support the entire family and have 4 kids and a couple of cars and all that. It's not the 1950s or 1960s anymore. Now, largely speaking, both parents have to work. They're having fewer kids later in life. You can see that by declining birth rates among most of the Western world. There is something to be considered about how many people do we want in this country, given our current resources, given all of the social and economic strife that we're facing, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. My thought is that we probably need to reduce the rate of immigration until we sort our own problems out. I personally like to clean my house before I have guests over. I think that America needs to clean up we've got a lot of stuff that we need to clean up before we're going to be a good place to have guests. That being said, we're still probably a much better place, even with a messy house, than a lot of other places in the world. But short term, assimilating immigrants does put an extra strain on some of the cultural and economic tensions that we're facing. Long term, I think it's probably beneficial, but we've got to get through these short term hurdles. And this is why I said that, I think we would be better off as a group, not just us, but the world as a whole, certainly the Western Hemisphere, if we focused our efforts on improving these other countries. Now, I think long-term it'll probably sort itself out. It just may not sort itself out as efficiently as it would be if we were intelligent about it. And we need to make sure not to strain our welfare systems and our systems for helping people. The reality is right now, the government as a whole spends way more money than it brings in. It makes up for this by essentially printing dollars. And that's causing inflation. That's going to cause all sorts of long-term, or at least medium-term negative effects. And we could see a collapsing economy, and that's not going to be very good for us. Now, I think low-wage immigrants will probably actually do well in a collapsed economy because it won't be that much worse, or won't be any worse than what they're used to at home. And they're going to typically know how to survive, and that may help us quite a bit. But as a general rule, we're going to be probably for the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have some pretty rough times, and I think we need to focus on sorting that out. I think that a lot of our foreign adventurism is not helpful. I think it makes us. I think it causes us more problems than it helps on the world stage. And I think we're going to pay the price for that eventually. So it's not really a cut and dry, subject. I know a lot of people are like, diversity is our strength, and as I think those are probably well-meaning people, but diversity is usually not a strength, actually. If you look historically speaking, certainly cultural diversity tends to cause more problems than it helps. I think religious diversity. Look at the Middle East; it's a mess. At least until the I think Islam has largely dominated the Middle East now. But just ask the Orthodox Christians who used to live in the Middle East how diversity worked out for them. Racial diversity, I think, doesn't matter. I think that America is largely not a racist place. There are some racist people, but I think most people don't care about race. Certainly in the circles that I travel in. But we have to be very careful about diversity just for the sake of diversity. I know a lot of people want there to be better representation across different racial and cultural and religious groups, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't force it, because in a society based around individual merit, the focus should always be around the individual candidate for a job or for a position. And when you make diversity a factor, I think it causes unnecessary strife, and I think it hurts diversity in the long run. And that's something to consider. Looking back at my life, I've always had a very diverse set of friends. I've never cared about diversity. It's never been something I've thought about. But by not considering diversity, by not caring about diversity, it turned out I had a very diverse set of friends. People with very liberal and very conservative beliefs, a bunch of different races and religions. It never occurred to me until I sat back and thought about it, just because my neighbor, who happens to be a Kickapoo Indian, brought it up. It's like, hey, Mark, you travel in some interesting crowds. I'm like, oh, I never thought about it. So, for the diversity is our strength crowd, I think personally the best way to achieve diversity is to not care about it. Just like the best way to achieve racial integration is to not think about it that much. Just focus on finding good people and hanging out with good people. From an American perspective, I think immigration is generally good as long as it's at a rate that we can assimilate. All things good in moderation kind of thing. I think too much of a good thing becomes bad. And creates an unnecessary burden. But we should be focused on bringing good people over who will help our country and help our communities. That should be the goal. And it shouldn't matter where they come from. That being said, we need to also balance that with, we don't want to wreck the rest of the world, because when we have a brain drain and bring all the successful people over here, and it has adverse effects on the countries that they left when it happens in mass. If it's a small number of people, it's not a big deal, but when it happens in mass, it can be very detrimental, and it can hold those civilizations back by generations. Iran, for example. So there's a lot of things that we need to consider, and I think that, you know, my more liberal-minded friends, not that I'm particularly conservative, but most people would consider that, I suppose, just because I'm more contrarian than anything else. I like to, my opinions tend to be very nuanced and subtle, and a lot of times people don't understand that. And that's what I'm trying to make this video to explain. I think that my friends, my more liberal-minded friends, and certainly my friends on the left, need to consider that there are consequences to decisions. You know, you need to make a connection between cause and effect. And if you don't do this, you're going to end up with some very surprising results. Like, for example, a bunch of Hispanics in southern Texas suddenly voting Republican because they're really conservative. Who would have thought? So I think in our current situation, you know, as far as national policy goes, I think we do need a certain period of time to sort our own stuff out. You know, we certainly do want some form of border security so we can determine who's coming in and who's not. Because there are certainly some people that we don't want in here. Look at how the world would have been different if we hadn't let the 9/11 terrorists into America. My understanding is they all came in legally, largely on student visas. But if we had prevented them from coming in, then think about how many millions of people would have not been killed in these pointless wars over the years, you know, if they hadn't come and hadn't knocked down the World Trade Center. That's something to think about. So we have to be cautious about it. You know, once we have immigration security, we need to go and sort out our immigration policies. You know, largely speaking, our immigration policies aren't being enforced. And because it's beneficial to both sides to have the issue and not the solution. You know, Democrats want to be able to do their whole diversity is our strength thing, and Republicans want to be able to do the whole immigration is bad. Or at least illegal immigration is bad. And it's a means for them to rally voters around their policies, and it gives them a nice issue to fight over. Well, that's not really helpful. And then once we sort out our immigration policies, then we need to look at the people who are here illegally and decide, you know, who do we want to keep and who do we want to toss? You know, obviously the criminals who are here illegally, we probably want to toss them back to their home countries. Not that their home countries want them back. And the people who are beneficial to our society, we need to integrate in. We need to have them here. That's not really all that controversial if you think about it, honestly. But people want to fight over it because it's a great election issue. And the reality is that most of our leaders on both sides are incompetent, and a lot of them are corrupt and greedy. So, if we're being honest about the situation, it really needs to be handled in many ways on a case-by-case basis, and we have to have policies and people implementing the policies who we trust to make good judgments on a case-by-case basis. But we need to understand the broader causes of the effects that we're seeing, and we need to start remedying those causes. Fix up some of these troubled countries so that there's not such a pressure for people to leave. That would reduce the burden on us, it would make things better for them, and it would overall improve the state of humanity. And that should be our goal, I think, is to make the world overall a better place. Anyway, these are my thoughts. And I'd be happy to go into details on any specific questions that people will have. So feel free to ask questions in the comments, or you can reach out to me on social media. And I'd be happy to have a conversation. But like I said, you know, if you accuse me of a bunch of bullshit, then I'm just going to assume that you're an idiot, and I probably won't respond. But I'll be more than happy to have an honest conversation with you about this. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. Goodbye. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. You can also check out my website, bobtheorc.com, where you can download a free copy of my dad's book and some other things. Have a nice day. Goodbye.